Imagination, Chapter 3, Captain Frostmane. It was finally done. When I had started the story, I was under the influence of different kinds of medications and pretty much not really myself. How else would I have thought that mixing J.L. Bond's Day by Day Armageddon and My Little Pony would be a good idea? When I had gotten better, I had discarded the story in its entirety. It wasn't written very well in any way. But after a few months, people started asking me about it, so I had picked it up again. I could barely believe that I was now looking down at the last few words of its sequel. I was happy and scared at the same time. The last 2 times I had finished one of my fanfictions, I had somehow ended up in the world of that story. Looking down at the last few words, I wanted to scrap this chapter and write a new one. I would have done it too, but I lacked any kind of idea on how to go on with this story. Even when I turned over the pages of my new notebook, since Celestia had borrowed my original one, I had to get a new one in town, my pencil just refused to move. I sighed, resigning myself to my fate. I really hoped that I didn't end up there this time, but looking back at my track record, it was more than likely. Just as I wanted to close the door behind me to go up to my room and record this latest chapter for my channel, I stopped. This was not the corridor that led to the stairs, which in turn would bring me up to my room. The first thing I noticed was neither that, for some reason, there wasn't even a door behind me, or that the hallway had no windows at all. Nor was it the fact that all the surfaces seemed to be made of metal. No, all these little details escaped my mind entirely, and I only realized them much later. The thing that caught my eye was a blood trail on the floor. It led into the direction I was facing, and by the looks of it, it was still fresh. How I was able to tell that was quite simple. The blood was still bright red and had not yet dried. That meant that whoever had come through this way was still somewhere nearby. Oh, who was I kidding? I knew exactly who had left this trail of blood. I had written the scene not 10 minutes ago after all. With a quick movement of my left shoulder, I grabbed my backpack and stashed away my notebook. Yes, I carry a backpack with me at all times. You can't imagine how much stuff I carried in there when I went out to write. Then I began to run as fast as I could, following the blood. I have no idea how long I had been running when I finally spotted her limp form, but I hoped that I was not too late. There she lay on her belly, her right foreleg stretched out as if she wanted to crawl further into that direction, but she wasn't moving. When I reached her, I didn't lose any time. I unbuckled my belt and took off my shirt. Ripping the latter to shreds, I made a compression bandage on the stump of her right hind leg, while my belt went around the stump of her left foreleg. Then I turned her onto her back. She wasn't breathing, nor was she protesting. Being a trained nurse, I knew that I had to bring her to an emergency room ASAP, but the next hospital was Pony&Wolf General Hospital. I dismissed that thought as soon as it had formed. That place was swarming with zombie ponies and I had nothing to fight them off with. Then I spotted it, a metal door with a red cross on it. I looked down to Frostmane again. Her pale blue coat was barely visible under all the blood. This strong and determined warrior looked so pitiful as she lay there in a pool of her own blood. I may have said it before, but I will say it again. I am overweight and I have barely any endurance. That's why it was even harder for me to actually carry Frostmane to the medical station. She wasn't that heavy, but I had just run more than I had in quite a while. I really had to get back in shape if this sort of thing happened more often from now on. Or maybe I should stop writing war stories and go for comedy or romance instead? At least it wouldn't involve me running from timber wolves or through a secret government facility, nor would it involve me carrying or dragging ponies around. The medical station was just as I had imagined it. Everything was white and sterile with several beds that lined the walls. And there on the far wall was what I had hoped to find, an auto dock. I almost slipped as I went over to it as fast as I could and placed Frostmane on it. For some reason the system addressed me as Princess Celestia when I started to work the console. The menu was easy enough to understand, well, for me at least. In a way I had invented this thing after all. All this jumping into my own stories was still very weird, but I felt less uncomfortable operating machines in those worlds. Since the time I had visited the doctor, I had figured out that I knew how to use those because I had been the one who had written them. A few configurations later, the Autodoc began its work on the pale blue unicorn mare. I may have been the one who wrote her and a trained nurse at that, but I still looked away when it lifted her tail to insert some tubes for waste removal. I could only sit there on the floor and watch as the Autodoc worked on her. I must stress the point that I may be a trained nurse, but I have no idea on how to treat a pony. On a monitor next to it, I could see that her heart was beating again, but she had lost a lot of blood. There were several tubes attached to her neck now, through which she was receiving a blood transfusion. I felt horrible. I had done this to her after all. Well, it was that explosion, but I was the one who wrote that explosion. It had all been much easier when I didn't have to worry about hurting my creations. When I could send them into battles against unspeakable evils without having to worry that I might actually see them hurt. My gaze fell downwards to my bare chest. The locket Celestia had given me hung there. Seeing it got me thinking. I had to take my mind off of things anyway, so I decided to give it a try. "Computer, identify me," I ordered the mainframe of the base. A robotic voice answered me. "You are Princess Celestia, Your Highness." The power of sunlight, of course. That's why I wasn't freezing my head off while waiting here in only my jeans and shoes. A smile found its way onto my face. "Celestia, you clever, clever girl." I thought as I watched the Autodoc attach 2 artificial limbs to Frostmane's stumps. They seemed to adjust themselves as soon as I got into contact with the raw flesh of her wounds. A few minutes later, the Autodoc opened again and I could go over to see if she was alright. She now had 2 more cybernetic implants, but I thought that this was a small price to pay for her life. Going over to one of the consoles, I found out that this medical station had 10 medical robots in its storage room. I activated them and gave them the command to keep Frostmane alive and healthy no matter what happened. They confirmed the order and went back to standby mode. The little floating spheres, with a red cross on the front, looked kind of cute as they floated back to where they had come from. I don't know how long I waited, but I had to use the Gentle Cold's room twice, and I can tell you that it was not an easy feat to do so. Damn me and my writing about pony toilets. After a long time, Frostmane finally opened her blue eyes. It took some time for her to realize that she was alive and even more augmented than she had been before. I guessed that she thought she had made it to the medical station after all, but then she saw me. Half naked and a cigarette between my lips. I must have been a really ugly sight. With a groan, she tried to sit up, but I was at her side in an instant and pressed her down to the bed again. It was harder to do so than I had imagined. Even hurt as she was, I had to use both of my hands to do so. Then came the usual question and answer session. In retrospect, maybe I should have just lied to her. "What the buck are you?" she asked, not a hint of weakness in her voice. Other than Moonsinger, Frostmane did not take what I told her very well. Instead, I got a good impression of her hoof-to-hoof combat training and her new augmented strength as she jumped up and pinned me to the floor. I was lucky that my cigarette landed next to me and didn't fall into one of my eyes when I was pushed over. "You killed them all! All of them! It's your fault!" She screamed into my face, emphasizing every word with a kick from her foreleg. It was more than fortunate that I was able to evade the blows she tried to inflict with her left metal hoof, because those left deep indentations in the metal floor. "Frostmane, listen, I'm sorry. Please, let me explain," I pleaded, my front teeth mostly broken and I could feel my eyes starting to swell shut. I even tried stopping her flesh and blood hoof with both of my hands, but that only resulted in me punching my own face repeatedly. I was on the verge of passing out when her augmented right hind leg kicked me where it really hurts. I could feel my balls being crushed, not to mention ripped off, by the force of that kick. "That's for my family, you monster!" was the last thing I heard before the world blurred out of existence around me. I woke up with a gasp in the hallway of my home. As usual, my injuries were gone, but my belt and shirt were missing. I also still felt much of the pain that she had inflicted on me. But what hurt even worse was that she had been crying while she had beaten me to a pulp. I knew I deserved it for writing an ending like this for her, but it still hurt. I had wanted to help her somehow make it hurt less for her, like I had done with the Doctor and Moonsinger. As I walked up to my room, I found a few strands of pale and dark blue hair on me. I carefully took a plastic bag out of a drawer in my room and put them in there. It was then that I realized that the only way I could even attempt to make it up to Frostmane was if I got to work on a sequel right away. A sequel to make it all better. My body still insisting that it had just received the beating of a lifetime, I took out my notebook and got to work.